So hi everyone, thanks again for joining us today. Thank you Arun for speaking, it's great to have you. So Arun Mathur is the Executive Director and Lead Instructor at UltimQuest Knowledge Inc., offering corporate training on improving governance, ethics, internal control, fraud prevention, KPI, and related topics. He's provided live and online training through CPA bodies, private organizations, universities, and colleges across the country for over 35 years. He's partner at Gerald Duthie & Co. LLP, providing professional service to diverse clients across Canada and the USA. He's served on the board of directors at Healthforce Ontario as the chair of the Finance and Audit Committee and at Trillium Gift of Life Network. He's also served on the CMA Ontario's Review Committee prior to the merger. In 2018, he was honored with a fellowship designation from the CPA Ontario. Through his practical insights and unique perspective, he empowers business professionals, owners, and executives to improve governance and cultivate strong ethical leadership in their organizations. Thanks again for speaking today, Arun, and good luck with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Alex. So nice to be able to address our members today. I'm delighted to speak about ethical decision-making in a crisis. 2020 was a bit of a roller coaster year. I guess the ride is still not over. I don't think anybody could have seen what was coming. 2020 really was a test of an organization's strength. So I guess you've done my introduction, so I'm going to just go through this. Let's continue with the topic of ethics. So when you think of any severe crisis, one of the questions that arises is which kinds of organizations are going to be able to withstand the storm, withstand the crisis, perhaps struggle, suffer a little bit, but they'll prevail and survive. And on the other hand, which organizations might actually fall apart and crumble as a result of the crisis. So obviously there are many factors that go into this, into that outcome. But one of the things I believe very strongly is how strong is the organization's foundation? Is the organization grounded in ethical decision-making? So I believe that what we need to do is to build an ethical foundation in an organization long before there is a crisis, for example, like the COVID crisis. So this afternoon, I'm going to discuss with you three different things. The conversation we're going to have is, number one, how can we respond in a crisis? Number two is what can we learn from actual crisis cases? And number three, we want to consider whether ethical leaders will cope better in a crisis or not. So this is what we have in store for you for the next few minutes. I thought we'll start by defining ethics. So when we use the word ethics, what are we talking about? So ethics is defined as moral principles that governs a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. So when we use the term person, we're talking about an individual, we're also talking about an organization, and we're looking at how are we behaving, right? So these principles can apply to individuals, they can apply to organizations. You might be wondering, where are these moral principles coming from? What is the source of these principles? Who created them? So I can tell you briefly that there are four main sources. Number one, we have the area of philosophy. So we have people like Immanuel Kant, Aristotle, we have a social justice theory. So these are philosophers who've said that human beings need to be concerned about other human beings, not just about their own well-being. The second main source of moral principles are the world religions. So even though the world religions may appear very different, they were formulated in different languages, in different times of history, they were in different cultural settings, one thing is common is that all world religions speak to ethics, and they speak to how should we behave with other human beings. The last two things I wanted to mention, just in terms of definitions, we have the concept of values. So these values could be like honesty, fairness, harmony, things that as a society we care about. And then we have virtues like courage, perseverance, patience, loyalty. These are considered like personality characteristics. So you'll see virtues and values being articulated in mission statements. You'll see them articulated when organizations talk about their corporate culture. So that was business ethics. Now the question is, sorry, that was ethics. Now the question is, what are business ethics? So business ethics is how we apply those moral principles in business situations. So how do we use our moral principles when we're dealing with employees, with regulators, with lenders, with suppliers, with customers, perhaps with the community? So one of the things I wanted to address right off the bat is the whole question of, do we have to behave ethically? Do we have to treat people with respect? Do we have to speak the truth? So when you look at the law is dictating certain behavior and certain requirements, and those are the legal requirements. But there are many other things outside of the law that we feel are good to do, but they're not going to be enforced by the law. So for example, we don't have an ethics police, we don't have a court of ethics. So you might be wondering, should we bother with these things? Is it enough just to comply with the law? Because we're looking at spending time and energy and money to look at moral principles and to look at ethical behavior, which is not required by law. So one of the reasons that you might want to think about a strong foundation, and that strong foundation would be good ethical behavior, good governance, good relationships, is the whole idea of what happens when there's a storm, what happens when there's a crisis. So organizations that have a strong foundation will withstand a crisis. In contrast with that, if you have organizations whose roots have rotted, maybe employees don't care, customers don't care, suppliers don't care, lenders don't care, those types of organizations are going to have a much harder time when it comes to a crisis. So on this slide, I've just noted some of the things that would form the foundation of an organization. So you can see we're talking about good governance, we're talking about risk management, we're talking about internal control, ethics, hiring practices, and proper conduct, employee satisfaction, all of these types of things. Of course, there are many, many other factors as well. So what I'm saying is, in a crisis, you're going to be faced with very tough decisions, and it's going to test your strength. So if you think about aggressive business practices, you think about borrowing too much money, not saving for a rainy day, not having a sound risk management process, not taking a long-term perspective, but having a short-term kind of thinking. All of these things are going to come back to haunt us when it comes to a crisis, right? On the other hand, ethical organizations will find that their people will work with them both internally and externally. And you can see how an unethical organization could fall apart very quickly in a crisis. So I wanted to share 4 ideas with you on crisis response. And it's interesting, like we drafted all this last summer thinking that the COVID crisis was a 2020 event, but we're still in it right now. After I go through these four ideas on crisis response, we're going to look at 2 Canadian case studies to illustrate these points. The first point I wanted to make is that we want to avoid a knee-jerk reaction. This would be something you do out of impulse, you do like immediately without thinking things through. The problem with the knee-jerk reaction is you could be creating a lot of collateral damage. You could be losing your most precious employees, your suppliers, customers, lenders. You could be destroying relationships that took years and years to build. So this is something that you would come back later and regret. So you might be asking, well, what am I suggesting instead of a knee-jerk reaction? So I'm suggesting we take a slightly longer-term view. No matter how severe the situation is, we should always seek a better solution. So my suggestion is we should pause, we should think, we should meet the people around us, talk things over, perhaps sleep on it, let our subconscious mind engage, and talk to the people who are in your front lines, your stakeholders, your frontline workers, to get kind of a better view of what's going on. The second suggestion I can make is that we want to respond according to our core values. So when you look at a crisis, an organization could be faced with a very severe financial crisis, perhaps a disappearing bottom line. You also have a concern for your stakeholders. It's a very difficult balancing act. That crisis could be crippling our cash flow. It could be crippling our operations, maybe even threatening the actual existence of the entity. So under that kind of pressure, you might set aside your core values and you might stray away from your mission. And what I'm saying is you may be forced to take very drastic action, but at the same time, I'm recommending let's not abandon our core values. So what are the core values in an organization? This is your DNA. This is what identifies the company and says, this is what we stand for. This is what we care about. This is what we don't care about. So different organizations have different core values. It could be customer experience. It could be quality of the work. It could be innovation, collaboration. You might care about the community in which you operate. So realigning with your core values is going to be very helpful in a crisis. And let me just explain very quickly why. So number one, it'll lead you to a better decision. Number two, it's going to direct you to what you actually care about. So you can then improve your communication to your stakeholders. They'll have a better understanding of why you're making the decision that you're making. So it's going to improve how your employees, your customers, and others are going to react to the decisions that you're making. So I think this will give them a better understanding of your company, what your company stands for. So bottom line is, I'm saying don't abandon your core values, no matter how severe the crisis is. The next thing I have in mind is to talk about using our heads and our hearts. What I'm recommending here is that we think about what are we good at. So what are we good at is our competence. So if we're good at something, we should think about how can we harness that competence to do good, right? How can we help our stakeholders? How can we help our community so that your organization's response will be a positive response? So one of the important things in a crisis like COVID is that we're all scrambling and people are given like a deck of, they're given a hand in cards, which nobody anticipated. A lot of organizations are not prepared. So what I'm suggesting is you have to be careful because your stakeholders will remember how you treated them long after the crisis is over. So you don't want to be unaware of that, right? So when it comes to the head and heart, I can tell you, I heard of a downtown Toronto store that was charging like $20 for a little bottle of hand sanitizer back in March, April last year, which is worth like $1, right? I heard about airlines that refused to refund money when the flights were canceled. So these customers will remember how you behaved with them long after the crisis is over. So obviously, there are also very good examples of organizations responding. I heard of a US company that actually accelerated the payments to their suppliers during the summer last year. And instead of paying in 30 days or 45 days, they paid within 14 days, right, to keep their suppliers alive, right? So there are many examples. The last thing I wanted to comment on as far as these 4 ideas is that I'm suggesting that we need to roll up our sleeves and do our best when the crisis is as severe as the COVID crisis. So obviously there's no right or wrong way. There are no prescriptions. I don't think anybody is sitting on a manual that showed them how to tackle this kind of a crisis. But you try things, some things are going to work, some things are not going to work. You have to keep going. So basically the idea is to roll up your sleeves, do what you can, focus on what you can do, because a lot of things that we'd like to do, we're unable to do, right? So the idea is to stay positive. The last thing I wanted to mention in terms of crisis response is that we should be aware of how we fit into the ecosystem of our company or our organization. So we should be aware of the impact of our decisions on other people in our ecosystem. So, we may be making a decision that puts them in a crisis. We may be making a decision that makes their life harder. So we should be aware of our stakeholders, like the shareholders, the employees, customers, suppliers, lenders, all of them, so that we're not unaware of the implications of our decisions. Okay, so let's get into these crisis cases. So I'm going to share with you 2 Canadian crisis cases, and hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes at the end to take your questions as well. I would love to see your response to the things that I'm mentioning. So these 2 cases illustrate the crisis response that I just talked about. They're both Canadian companies, and this case relates to the summer of 2020, and both companies were in a crisis. So I didn't get permission to disclose the names of the companies. Let's just call them Company A and Company B. And I'll start. The focus of my thing is on how the companies treated their employees. So let's start with the background, and I'll tell you what were the similarities between these 2 companies. So first of all, both companies were operating right across Canada. Both companies were hit with a sudden reduction in revenue, very significant reduction in revenue back in March, April 2020. They both had similar market conditions, very uncertain cash flow. They both needed to reduce payroll costs quite significantly. Now let's talk about the differences. So Company A, the employees didn't think that the leaders actually cared about the employees. They didn't have too much respect for the CEO and the CFO. The leaders appeared to have a bottom line kind of orientation. They were focused on increasing sales and reducing costs, and the company did not seem to care about the community that it was in. Now, in contrast with Company A, let me talk about Company B. So Company B, the CEO took a lot of interest in their employees. They actually had a chief people officer in the company, and they brought in workplace experience experts to look at work experience and work-life balance and these types of issues. They had very open lines of communication between the CEO and the employees. There was a high trust relationship. The leadership team was respected by the workforce. They worked on the workers' career development. They were involved in the community. They did a lot of volunteer work in the community. So the workers felt like they were part of a very strong team. You can see the difference just in the 2 companies from what I've described so far. So this was the background. Now let's examine how Company A responded to the COVID crisis back in March and April of 2020. The first thing is the company made decisions very quickly. They went to their sales staff and they proposed a 50% cut in base salary with a promise to increase the percentage commission. So their idea, their rationale was that, their rationale was that they were sharing the pain with their sales force. So if the sales came back later in the year, everybody's fine. If the sales didn't come back later in the year, they've shared the financial pain with the sales staff. The option they gave to their sales staff was, if you don't want this deal, then you can leave the company. We'll give you 3 months pay. There's no hard feelings. We'll leave on good terms. And this is the proposal that they made in a blanket manner to all their sales force across Canada. Now, 50% of the sales force took the 3 months pay and made a decision to leave the company. And I would guess that 50% was probably the most effective or the best salespeople that they had. So they lost half of their sales force. They lost the people running their operations in Ontario and so on, which is the biggest market for the company. So to me, the company didn't think things through. They regretted this decision. I heard that during the fall and winter of 2020, they called back every one of these salespeople 4 times and begged them and urged them to come back. They offered more money and all kinds of things. I even heard that in November of 2020, they hired a general sales manager who quit the company within three weeks. So that was company A. Now let's look at company B, how they responded to the same crisis in March and April of 2020. So I'm going to relate their response to the 4 comments I made as far as crisis response. So the first one was to avoid a knee-jerk reaction. So one of the things in company B was that they had open communication from day one. The CEO would post his thoughts on a daily basis. He would talk about what's happening in the company, what kinds of options he had, all the ruminations and ideas that he was thinking about. He would mention that in these daily briefings. And then on one day in March, he said that the general manager is going to contact each employee within the next 2 days, and we have to look at how can we reduce the payroll cost. And this kind of got the ball rolling, right? At that point, the managers in this company proactively took a 30% pay cut, even before they went to the staff. Then they went to their staff and they encouraged them to propose a pay cut that they could manage with, that they were comfortable with, based on their family circumstances, based on their cash needs. And they empowered their employees to propose a pay cut. The options were, you could cut like 50, 30, 20, 10, even 0, right? So it was not mandatory. Now, responding according to your core values, you can see that the CEO put the employees first. He even said to them that he hated asking for a pay deferral and a pay cut. And he said his rationalization was that he wanted to keep everyone employed. He didn't want to have to terminate and lay off people. That was the other option, right? And he wanted people to respond based on their family commitments, based on their cash needs. He also guaranteed to them that if you did not take any pay cut, it would not affect your promotions, it would not affect the future in the company. And the goal was just to keep the company alive and to keep everybody employed. He even discussed ideas of job sharing and reducing a work week to 4 days a week and things like that. So this is a very different approach of empowering your employees to come back and propose versus telling them that there has to be a cut. The other thing here was the transparency, and the communication was very open. It was like a mindset that we're in this crisis together. It's not like my company and you're a worker in my company. It was more like we're part of one company and we're trying to do it for the company. So it was also possible for employees to question the CEO and he would answer and so on. So using the head and the heart was the third recommendation that I had made, or the third idea. So let me explain something that this company did. So during this period of April, May, June of 2020, this company identified a need to match the personal protective equipment that the healthcare and the hospital and the government needed against the personal protective equipment that people had in their possession that were willing to donate or sell and so on. So this company went and created a platform to match the needs for personal protective equipment like masks, ventilators, hand sanitizer, and all of that with the people who had it, and expedited that. So they didn't go like the doctors and nurses to save lives, but they assisted the healthcare sector to do this matching, to provide this kind of protection. And it was done without any cost. It was given to the provincial government. And it ended up even being used in Europe, no charge at all. There was no chargeable hours, no revenue, nothing. So they did this as a way to help the community to cope with the COVID crisis, to save lives, right? The last point I made was to roll up our sleeves and do what you can. So you can see that this company is trying to do that. So when I look at the crisis response, these were the 4 ideas I mentioned. Number 1 is to avoid a knee-jerk reaction. Number 2 was to respond according to your core values. Number 3 is to use your head and your heart. Number 4 is to roll up your sleeves and do what you can. So I think this company B's case has shown and illustrated those points. I just wanted to mention a couple of other thoughts that I had. Number 1 is that you cannot become ethical overnight. So when you have a crisis, you can't suddenly say, well, now we're going to become ethical and do things ethically. It's really a little bit too late, right? So the leader set the tone. So the leader should set the tone of ethics long before a crisis arises, right? So you may be thinking that the CEO of this company B was a sucker. People took advantage of him. He could have done something better. Let me tell you the outcome after the crisis. Company B obtained a huge contract in the fall of 2020, and they bid for a contract. The customer said to them, your bid was not the lowest, but we see what you're doing in the community, and this is why we are giving you this work. The third quarter of 2020 was the biggest quarter for the company in its history. They had the highest sales and the highest bottom line. I should also tell you that all these salary deferrals that were done by employees were repaid immediately in the third quarter. So it was a very short period. So I wanted to wrap it up by going back and saying that organizations that have a strong foundation, that are investing their time and money in principles and values, using their ethical compass, living up to their core values, are going to have a much stronger foundation than any organization that is simply geared towards money, strategy, and the bottom line, because that kind of organization is going to be scrambling when you have a dramatic crisis like the COVID crisis. So just to wrap it up, I believe that ethical business practices do provide a high return on investment. This is even more critical when you're dealing with a crisis. I wanted to thank you for participating in this session. We actually don't know how long this crisis is going to last. When I polled last year, people thought it would be finished by September of last year. And here we are in April of 2021. We don't know what the new normal will be. We don't know how many organizations might be out of business. I can say with confidence that your survival will depend on how you treat your stakeholders during the crisis. Canadian organizations that take an ethical approach during the crisis will in fact bring Canada back to prosperity. Thank you so much for participating. I think we're going to come out of this gradually. It's going to take courage. It's going to take compassion. It's going to take collaboration. So Alex and Rachel, I don't know how much time I have. I don't know if we have time for questions. I'm willing to stay back for another 5 or 10 minutes if that's appropriate. I would love to answer any questions that are there. You can also email your questions to me. I'd be glad to respond to questions that way as well.
Hi, Arun. I'm not sure if you can see me on your screen right now or not.
I can
Okay, great.
Yep.
Well, I just want to say thanks for your presentation. And yeah, if anyone watching has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat here. Arun does have about 5 or 10 so minutes before the session time is kind of over. So feel free to make use of that time, ask any questions. I'm sure he's a great source of knowledge, so definitely take use of his time here. But I just wanted to ask, I guess, while we wait for any questions that might be coming in, what is sort of the key or most critical point that you really want to hammer in with this presentation? Like, what's the one thing, or maybe even 2 or 3 things that you want people to most remember from this presentation?
So it's getting back to the value of ethics, right? Like quite often people think that ethics is like philosophy, or ethics is something that your grandmother or your mother told you, right? So the reality is that ethics will have an impact on your success. So people that are taking shortcuts, people that are thinking, well, in this crisis, when I speak in conferences across the country and we talk about ethical behavior, very often, not only in this country, but in other countries, people have come back to me and said, we have a oil price has tanked and our economy is tanked and we're in a corrupt environment. And people give me all these reasons why taking an ethical approach may not work, because your competitors are unethical, the marketplace is unethical, people are doing bad things, or there's a need for you to just take your money and run kind of mentality. And all these rationalizations are true. I accept them. But in my experience from having been a CPA for about 40 years, I look at clients and I look at people who are taking the unethical routes. There's always going to be an outcome. There's no escape, right? So this is the main message that I give is it may appear like something is expedient, something needs to be done because of some urgency or pressure. But the reality is that if you do the unethical thing, you're going to have to pay for that. There's no free ride.
For sure. That's definitely a great point. Well, so it does look like there is no questions here, unfortunately. So I just want to say thanks again for your presentation. And anyone who's watching, feel free to get in touch with Arun. His contact information is up on chat on his slide there. Are you also on LinkedIn as well? If people want to get in touch with you there, okay, great.
I am on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to connect on LinkedIn. And one of the things that I'm doing across the country in the last 2 years is to gather people's crisis response stories and to gather people's ethics stories. So I hear them from right across Canada, including Bermuda. So if you've experienced something in your organization in the last year and a half, I would love to hear that. And, my whole approach is to share ideas with CPAs across Canada. We take something from British Columbia and take it right across to Newfoundland. And I think a lot of us are having similar experiences. So it makes the training very powerful if we share real experiences. That's what I hope to do.
Wow, that sounds great. Yeah, it's definitely very helpful, I think. Well, yeah, thanks again. And I just wanted to say thanks for speaking. And just to let everyone know, so we do have about 10 free minutes before our panel starts. So if you feel free to visit the networking area or the expo area of the event in the meantime. But yeah, thanks again, Arun, for speaking. It's great to have you today.
Thank you very much. It was really nice to speak.
Thank you. Bye.
Best wishes. Bye.